Hello everyone, this is the demonstration video for task 6.1 basic authentication and authorization. So, in this task, we are required to implement two vital information security processes, authentication and authorization, to protect our system and information. Basically, authentication verifies the user's or service identity, and authorization determines their rights. And these are the steps for this task. These are the requirement of the task. Now, the key learnings which I gained from this task are: first one, understanding the authentication and authorization. And basically authentication, as discussed, it verifies the identity of user, while authorization determines their rights. HTTP context is a crucial abstraction over HTTP request and data, allowing developers to manipulate HTTP protocol data. HTTP context provides information like authorization, authentication, request, response, session, etc. The second learning is setup of infrastructure and bounded context. So, creating a new context for managing users and authentication, defining the user class with properties like ID, email, first name, last name, password hash, etc. Creating a user entity table in database with appropriate data types and auto incremented ID. Then the third learning is implementing a basic authentication. The basic authentication relies on HTTP header authorization. Authentication is handled by custom basic authentication handler inheriting from authentication handler. A handler's handle authenticate async method decodes the credentials, verifies them, and issues authentication tokens. Endpoints, and the fourth one is the user management, adding endpoints in the user controller for user registration, login, and management. The endpoints include get request for fetching users, post for adding new users, put for updating user, and delete for deleting the user, which are the CRUD operations basically. The fifth one is password management. So using password hasher from the ASP netcore identity to secure hash passwords. Hash passwords are stored in the database instead of plain text password. Then the sixth one is the authentication logic. So handling the authentication logic in basic authentication handler, extracting and decoding credentials from authorization header, verifying password using password hasher, issuing authentication tickets with appropriate claims. And the seventh one is authorization, which is defining the authorization policies using claims in program.cs, adding policies like admin only and user only based on user roles, protecting endpoints with authorization attributes like authorized policy, admin only, and comprehensive access control over the policies of all endpoints using different policies and claims to restrict access to specific endpoint. So basically, if I talk about an overview what I have done in this task, so basically this task provides an hands-on experience in implementing basic authentication authorization in web API, understanding HTTP context, user management, password hashing, authentication logic, and access control policies. Now, let's jump into the code of this task. So, starting from the program.cs file, firstly, we are using directives used to import namespaces into the current file, making types in those namespaces accessible without fully qualifying them their names. So here, firstly, we are the robot controller API.persistence. Basically, this line contains the classes or the methods and related to the persistence such as database operations. Then we are implementing the models for OpenAPI and the authentication for providing the types of authentication middleware, security claims for handling the claims based identity, Microsoft ASP.NET Core for providing and managing the user identities in ASP.NET Core, and the last one is the using the robot controller API.authentication for using the functions in the authentication. Now, coming on, we firstly created an instance of web application builder which is used for configuring and building the ASP.NET Core applications. Then then where we register the controller for handling the HTTP request, and after this we registered a scope service for hashing the passwords, and then we as the password hasher is a built-in class used for hashing the passwords, and then we configure the basic authentication. It specifies the application will use basic authentication scheme and basic authentication handler to handle it. Then we configure the authorization policies. Two policies are added here, uh, that are admin only and user only. The admin only policy requires the admin role, while the user only policy requires the user admin or user role. It can work on both admin as well as on the user. Then we build the ASP.NET Core application using the configured service in the middleware. And moving further, uh, we add the authentication middleware to the request pipeline. This middleware authenticates the incoming request, and then we are using the authorization middleware for then we are using the authorization middleware. So this middleware is used for request to provide the request pipeline, and this middleware checks if the authenticated user is authorized to access the requested resources based on the defined policies. Then we use the HTTPS redirection. So basically, it ensures that the communication between the client and the server is encrypted and secure. And lastly, we are using the map controllers. So uh, this uh, this is done because to map the controllers and their actions to the endpoints in the application. It enables the application to handle incoming HTTP requests based on their defined controllers and their defined methods. So now let's now these are the classes for the same. Like for map, these are the map class which has these properties like id, rows, columns, names, created date, modified date, description, and here the description can be a null value. It can accept a null value. And then we have defined the constructor for the map class. Similarly, we have the our login class which contains two properties which are email and password. And for user, we have these properties like id, email, first name, last name, password hash, description, role, date, date time, created date, and modified date with the respective constructor for the user class. Similarly, it is done for the robot command.cs as well. So robot command.cs has these particular properties like id, name, is move command, created date, modified date, description, etc. with the constructor for robot command class. Then moving on to the our next code file, which is basic authentication handler. So firstly, uh, these are the directives uh, which I have which are imported in this task for handling the basic authentication. So these directives, for example, the system namespace provides the fundamental types and the base classes that define the commonly used value, reference data types, events, and event handlers interfaces. The namespaces like Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication and Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authorization provide classes and interfaces related to authentication and authorization. Now, moving further, we defined our namespace, which is robot controller API.authentication, and then we are defining our class named as the basic authentication handler that inherits from the authentication handler, and it is responsible for handling the basic authentication request. Then so basically the here we have used the authentication scheme options. So this one is because the authentication scheme options is a class provided by the ASP.NET Core that represents options associated with authentication scheme. So if we talk about this code, for this task, it is used as a generic parameter for the basic authentication handler, indicating the options specific to authentication scheme. So in the constructor of basic authentication handler, we are further creating an instance for the I option monitor. So I option monitor is injected, allowing access to the options associated with authentication scheme. These options can include settings like default challenge scheme, default sign-in scheme, and other configuration related to authentications. So, the authentication scheme options provide flexibility in configuring how authentication is handled within the ASP.NET Core application. It allows the developers to define various aspects of authentication behavior, making it adaptable to different requirements. Then, as you can see, we have defined a private read field for iPassword hasher to use the iPassword hasher interface, and we are creating its instance as the password hasher. This is a private field, and it is a read only because it can only be created, but it can't be modified. Like it can only be created, it's for read only. Then we are this is a constructor. So as discussed, it is firstly using the I options monitor. So I options monitor is used to access the options associated with authentication scheme. It allows retrieving options in a strongly typed manner. Then we are using iLogger factory. So the iLogger factory, so before going to iLogger factory, uh, let let me know you what are the options available when we configure the application. So when we configure the application, there are options related to authentication scheme like default authentication scheme, default challenge scheme, cookie authentication like cookie name, login path, logout path, return URL parameter, or like we can use JWT token, JSON Web Token for authentication options like issuer, audience, valid user, validate audience, validate lifetime, and authorization policies. These are some uh, these are some authentication scheme options which are available when we configure the application. Then uh, we have used the iLogger factory. So iLogger factory is an interface for creating the logger instances. It is a part of login infrastructure that allows us to log information, warnings, errors, and other messages throughout our application. So in this code, the iLogger factory provides us the methods to create the instance of iLogger, and iLogger instance is used to actually write the log messages. The logger instances are created in a specific categories. The categories are strings used to categorize log messages, often representing the component or the area of the application where the message originated. And iLogger factory is responsible for managing the logging providers. A logging provider is a component basically responsible for recording log messages to a specific destination such as a console file, event log, etc. There are different logging levels. Each level corresponds to a method on the logger interface, which I think we can not discuss here because it will become a very long topic. And then we have used the URL encoder. So URL encoder is a class in the ASP.NET Core that provides method for encoding and decoding URL strings. It is used to ensure that the URL strings are properly formatted and safe for use in the web request. The main purpose URL encoder is to escape the characters in the URL that have special meanings such as spaces, question marks, etc. So the URL are correctly formatted according to URL encoding rules defined in RFC. RFCs here. Then we have created its instance as the encoder. Then we are using the iSystem clock. So iSystem clock is an interface for accessing the system related information. It is used to get the current date and the time similar to date time now. Then moving further, uh, we are overriding our task function, which is task authentication result, and this function basically is used for authentication of our basic authentication handler. So firstly, it is a protected function as it indicates that the method is accessible only within the class or the derived classes. And we are overriding this function to provide the custom authentication logic. Then the method returns a task that will eventually produce an authentication result object. The authenticate result indicates the outcome of the authentication attempt. And so now moving on to this function. So moving further, firstly we are adding a www authenticate header to the HTTP response. Basically, this header is required for basic authentication, indicating that the client needs to authenticate using the basic authentication scheme. Then we are passing the basic realm. So basically the realm is a resource, and it is a basically it provides a context to the user when he or she is working on a site, that which area or which resource he is trying to access. Like here, uh, it provides him a reference that what sort of information he is going to access. Like here he is going to access the robot controller, and it is the basic authentication. Then we are defining the authorization header variable, and this header retrieves the authorization header from the HTTP request. This header contains the credentials provided by the client. Then we are checking if the if no authorization header is present, or if it does not start with basic. If either condition is true, it means the client has not provided the basic authentication credentials. Then we are saying that no credentials are provided, and if it is false, then the try block is going to execute, and the try catch block wraps the code to handle any exception that might occur during the authentication process. Firstly, if it is true, then we are extracting and decoding the base 64 encoded credentials from the authorization header. So these credentials are firstly it is trimming the after the basic keyword. Like after basic keyword, what sort of the information, it is removing the basic keyword from the that information. Then then we are making another variable which is credentials, which is basically storing that our credential information from the header, that is basically in stored as a plain text. And the base 64 representation of bytes is converted to plain text using the UTF-8 format. And the credential are basically that it is converted from array of bytes to an array of characters here. So the credential provided here is the firstly it is an email, then colon, then the password. So after that we are splitting the decoded credentials into email and password. So in credentials, like if I talk about my credentials, then the first credential will be the Mayank 1@gmail.com, then colon, and after that the password which is I have passed there. So these two credentials are split in the email and password variables and stored there. Then we are retrieving a user from the database using its email, uh, which we got from the credentials. If the user is found, or if the is not found, or if the password is incorrect, if either condition is true, the authentication fails. Else, it checks if the password verification succeeds. It constructs a claim for the authenticated user, including the name and the role of that particular user. Then uh, we are constructing the identity and principal objects to represent the authenticated user. After creating the identity and principal objects, we are issuing an authentication ticket. So we are creating an instance for this as a ticket variable and uh, containing the principal and the authentication scheme name. And after this, we are returning that turns an authentication result indicating the success or the failure with an appropriate message, like with the authentication success or authentication failed. Then we are using the catch block for basically fetching the exceptions and for handling the exceptions which occur during this task. So it is firstly we are logging the exceptions using the logger that occurs during the execution of this code, and, we are returning an unsuccessful authentication result with a message indicating an internal service error. So this was the main concept and the main file of this task, which is the basic authentication handler. Then we have our similar files which we have used in our previous tasks, like map data access. Here we have defined the function for the map data for the map class, and firstly we are creating a connection string with the parameters as the details of our database, that is the host is the local host, username as postgres, password as my password, and my database is sit331. Then we are defining the function for this map class, like get robot map for fetching the details of the robot maps. It is using the SQL command, which is select star from map, and we are creating a database reader to execute that particular command. And all those commands are then mapped to the respective variables and then added to the uh, list. We have a list of map type which is we have created as the new map. Moving further, we have defined another method to fetch the square robot maps. So this method is working for those maps in which the uh, rows and columns are equal. So it is fetching the details of those particular maps, which is done, can also be done using the select command, like select star from map where rows equals to columns. And similarly, we are mapping the entries to the uh, respective fields using the data reader and the while loop, and we are returning that particular map. Then we are fetching any map with any particular id. Here we pass id as a parameter, and the SQL query for this is select star from map where id is equal to id. And similarly we are mapping the data, and here we are not returning any type of statement in the response body. Then we have created a function for uh, uh, inserting a new map into the database. So it is working with the command, with the SQL command as insert into map with the field name and the values with the respective values, and then we are mapping those particular values with the fields in the database. And here the main thing to note is the cmd dot execute query. So basically this function is used for executing the known query, execute known query. So basically this execute known query works as by indicating that uh, it is provided by the .NET framework to that .NET frameworks provider classes for executing SQL queries and SQL commands that does not return any data. So here the methods such as insert, update, delete, these three things does not return any type of data. And the purpose of execute known query is used to execute SQL commands that does not return any data. Instead of fetching the data, it performs an action on the database. And if we talk about returning it returns an integer representing the number of rows affected by the command. Like for insert, update and delete command, this value indicates the number of rows inserted, updated or deleted for these particular commands. Then we have the update map function. So this function is for updating the entries in the map database for the existing map. So firstly we are creating a connection, npg connection. Then this is the query for this, like update map table, set the parameters where the id is this for the given id. They're also using execute non-query. Then we are using the delete map function. So delete map function is used for deleting any particular map entry from the database, and it basically using the SQL query as a delete from the map where id is equal to id. And we have the last function for the map class, which is map index valid. So this function is used for checking that for any particular id the particular indexes or the particular coordinates are valid or not. So it returns true or else returns false if the index is valid or not. Similarly, we have defined the function for the robot command, which are get. Firstly, we are creating the connection string. Then we are creating a function for the get robot command to fetch all the commands from the robot. Uh, it is also returning the robot command in the response body. Then we have created the function for get move command. So this function is for those robot commands where the is move command is true, and it is returning those particular commands. Then we have made function for insert robot command to add a new robot command into our database. It is done using the insert into robot command with the respective column names and their values, which are mapped in the database with the cmd parameters. It is done, it's also using execute non-query. Then we have get robot command by id for fetching any particular robot command with that particular id. Here the SQL command is select star from robot command where id is id. Then we have the update robot command function for updating the robot command table, and here we have used the update robot command, set the columns with their values where the id is id. And then we have the delete robot command function for the robot command for deleting any particular entry from the database with respect to its id. Lastly, we have the user class for fetching the. Firstly, we have created the similar connection. Then we have the get all users for fetching the details of all users from the user table. Then we have get user by id for fetching any user details for that particular id. Then we have the get user by email for fetching a user with that particular email. And then we have the insert user function for inserting new user values into the table. Similarly, we have the update user function for updating the user, updating the existing user. And lastly, we have the delete user function for deleting the user entries from the user table. And after this declaration and defining of these methods, we are basically calling these methods in the controller part. So in the map controller, we have defined the endpoints for this, and the basic root for the map controller is api/maps, and we are calling these particular functions using the given endpoints like http get for fetching all robot maps, http map square fetching the square for fetching the maps for which columns and rows are equal, http get where for any particular id, http post for fetching the particular for inserting any particular map into the database, and http put for updating any particular map with the id, and also http delete for uh, uh, deleting any particular map in the database. And lastly, we have the http get for with the id and the parameters and the coordinate for checking the index is valid. So the main thing to note in these controllers is the authorization policy we have defined for the endpoints. So this authorization policy makes that particular endpoint liable to work only for that particular user for that particular credentials for which it is defined. Like if the user is authenticated and he has the power to use this endpoint, like the http post endpoint has a policy of admin on this, that this endpoint can only be used by the user which has the role of admin. Similarly, we have the robot commands, and here we have robot command endpoint like HTTP get for with the policy as admin only for fetching all robot commands, HTTP get move, HTTP for fetching the move commands, then fetching the commands with the IDs for posting the new user new robot command into the database. It is done also by admin only. Then we have the HTTP port for admin only database for existing for updating the existing records. And lastly we have the delete function for admin only. And similarly we have done for the user controllers. Here the base root is API users, and we are using the password hasher here for checking for using the password hash here. And firstly we are using the HTTP get. Here we are giving a keyword which is allow anonymous. So allow anonymous is used for giving the right to the application that uh, any user without authentication can use this endpoint and get the details of the users. As for user we does not need that we need to authenticate here, we justly can use these policies. Then we are using the HTTP get for with the respective ID for fetching the user with that ID. Then HTTP post for adding a new user. HTTP port for updating a existing user, and HTTP delete for deleting any particular user. Lastly, we are using the HTTP patch. So this endpoint is to update the email and password of a user, and we can done this by here we are not returning any type of content in the response body, but we are updating the user with that but with those email and passwords. So this was all about the code part of this code. Now let's move on to the working and the demos and the working part of this code using the postman. Firstly, before going to postman, let me show you the databases. uh, Let me show you my pg admin databases. Firstly, let me show you my map table. So this is my map table. Let me execute the query. This one is my map table, and this is my robot command table, as you can see, and this is my user table. This is my user table. So now let's move on to postman for checking the endpoints. Now let's run this code. .NET run. It is running. Map is slow due to many fields are working in this. This is my moving to the postman. I will create a new collection so that the other collections are not interrupted. I will run this all these queries in this new collection. use the first endpoint, which is API slash maps, and click on send. As you can see, it is returning the maps with their particular IDs and all the details from the map table. Then we have the another endpoint, which is map square. Here I have done the authorization. Let me show you this. So I will basically set the authorization. It is getting these particular username and password because I have done this before in another task. So you can see for next task, which is automatic testing. So the username is Mayank7 at gmail.com and the password is password. So now moving on to the map square, it is showing the all the map entries for which the rows and columns are equal. Then fetching any map with any particular ID, which is one. You can see it is fetching. Now let's add a new map. So now going to post, then to body then row. Now let's paste this for the reference. And firstly, we will remove the ID field because it will be auto generated, and the other two fields, which are created date and modified date, because this will also be auto generated. Now let's set this rows to 75 and columns as 17, and the map, let's say map number 9, and the description as description 9, and click on send. Oh, sorry, I have done a mistake. That is, I have passed the 1 as the parameter. So this is not the particular method for this. Now you can see it is done, and it is this particular map is created. And let me show you this in the by fetching the map records. As you can see, with ID number 20, this particular map is created, and this ID 20 is done before I have added multiple maps, and for using this particular application multiple times and deleting those particular entries, so it is given this ID as 20. As you can see, this is created. We can also delete we can also put this particular map, we can update this map like here. We have to copy this map and paste this one, and we can update anything like description 9 updated. For putting, we have to pass the one another parameter, which is 20 as the ID. Then click on send. As you can see, it is updated. And the last endpoint is delete endpoint. So for deleting this map from the database, so I am deleting this current map. Then click on send. It will not return any type of request, but say map deleted successfully. Let me show you this in the list, that this particular map exists or not. It will say the map, it will not return any type of content and say 204 no content. And let me show you the list as well to confirm it. As you can see, the map number 20, which we have recently added, is deleted. So moving further, we have our other endpoints like robot commands. So when I run this, you can see dispatching the details of the robot. Then the robot slash move, fetching the entries for which the isMove command variable is true. Click on send. as you can see, for these fields, for these entries, the is move command is true. Then we can also post any new request. For posting, let me copy this for the reference, paste this in the body, removing the id field, and the created and modified date fields. Now give it a name, like you can give this a name, speed. Yes. So it is a new command, and let me change this input command. So click on send. As you can see, it is created. Let me show you in the list as well. As you can see, it is created number 22. And then we can also put this command for putting. We have to pass the id and copy this. We can change these parameters as well. Just update it. Click on send. As you can see, it is updated here. We can also delete any particular robot command using the delete request. I am deleting this new entries, which is ID number for ID number 22. Click on send. As you can see, the command is successfully deleted. Now let's run this for the users using the API users group. When I click on send, oh sorry. Firstly, I have to get the request. So as you can see, it is fetching the details, and the password hash is also encrypted here. It is not displaying the password here. So here you can see the IDs as well in the maps. So then for users we have the ID. For ID number, let's say 9. Send. Then we can also put any particular user. We can also add any particular user. So for adding, firstly remove the ID, then remove the created date and modified date, and lastly we have to change the password. So here I am passing the email as mayank10@gmail.com, and the password is password mayank10@gmail.com. We have to put this in the quotes, and the next thing is the password.